It truly is good that we are here. Got a quote here. John Adams believed that public virtue, which he linked to private virtue is basically your character, is the essential foundation for a free government. He argued that without virtue, a republic cannot be sustained. Today we are honored to have a national civics leader who will share his thoughts about some of those time-tested virtues that, if practiced by its citizens, if practiced by you as you go from here, in both the public and the private sector, will keep our republic strong. At this time, I'd like to ask civics educator and SAL member, Mr. Jamie Dudash, to the podium to introduce today's speaker.
Welcome, members of the American Legion, Sons of the American Legion education team, volunteers, and most importantly, the leaders of tomorrow, the Boys State class of 2025. It was about 36 years ago in 1989 that I was sitting in the same space you are today as a Boys Stater. The experience truly does last a lifetime, and the connections you'll make with your city, county, and state mates will be lifelong in nature. My eventual college roommate was a young man I met at Boys State, and that chance meeting led to Hillsdale College. During my time at Dale, I was a resident assistant in the famous or infamous Galloway Hall. That was where I met two tremendous scholars, and they were nicknamed the Davids. And why the housing staff put Mr. David Joy and Mr. David Bobb in a room where both occupants' first name was David remains shrouded in mystery. Our guest speaker this morning is a tremendous advocate and tireless champion for civic responsibility and engagement, and someone I've had a good pleasure of knowing for over 30 years. Please let me share a little selected biography with you today of our keynote speaker. David Bobb has been a leading advocate for strong civics and history education in the United States. David serves as the president and CEO of the Bill of Rights Institute, the engine behind your civic virtue lanyard cards, a position he's held since 2013. David serves as on the advisory board for the United States Chamber of Commerce Foundation's National Civics Bee and on the steering committee for the Educating for Democracy, a cross-ideological roadmap for civic learning and engagement. Author of Humility, an unlikely biography of America's greatest virtue, and a chapter on Frederick Douglass in a 2019 volume published by Oxford University Press. David has written for the Wall Street Journal and Education Week, among numerous other publications. David earned a PhD in political science from Boston College. Please give a warm Michigan Wolverine Boys State welcome to Dr. David Bobb.
Wow, what a welcome at 8:30 a.m. in the morning. Thank you. That is amazing. Great to see you all. This is going to be a conversation, even though we're a large group today. So I hope you all are ready to talk a little bit about the principles that underpin our country. I want to start with a quotation. I'm going to jump right into things. We'll have a chance to talk. I'm so grateful, Jamie, for that warm welcome and introduction, Mark, for the opportunity to be here. I'm honored to be in the presence of the leaders who make this possible, and we're going to talk a little bit about the responsibility that they've undertaken and the charge I think that you're undertaking with this work today. But I want to start with a quotation. This one's from James Madison. How many of you have read any of the Federalist? Okay, so these things were packaged together. They were opinion editorials, the kind of thing that you might read now online, that in the hard copy of a newspaper appear in the back of the newspaper, and they were published every 2 to 3 days. Madison wrote the majority, Hamilton wrote a lot, and John Jay got sick and didn't contribute as much as they thought he was going to do. But these were basically pieces that were put out to the public to try to advocate for the ratification of the Constitution. But even more than that, they went really deep. And they went deep because politics pushes us there. it pushes us to ask big questions. And the question that I want to ask of you today is one of those, which is, who are you going to be? Who are you going to be as a human being? Who are you going to be as a man? Who are you going to be as a citizen? Okay, so here's my quotation. This is from James Madison. He's writing this in Federalist 55. Here I'm quoting. As there is a degree of depravity in mankind, which requires a certain degree of circumspection and distrust, so there are other qualities in human nature which justify a certain portion of esteem and confidence. Republican, small r, not the political party, Republican government presupposes the existence of these qualities in a higher degree than any other form. Now I know it's early, but can anybody give me a 21st century translation of what Madison was saying there? Yes, jump in.
While some factors may lead the citizen to like a feeling of distrust, the overall good will like overtake that and lead to like public agreement and cooperation.
Okay, anybody want to add to that? Did that capture the kind of sentiment here? I think there's an if involved here. And this is the big question for us today, I think, as a country. Do we have what it takes to get to those qualities that justify what Madison calls the esteem and confidence? What he's basically saying here, I think, is that, look, human beings are a mixture. There's bad in them, and there's good. We can live up to our better angels, but it takes a lot of work. Now that itself is a controversial statement, right? Because some people think that, and there's political theorists that for a long time have said, human beings are basically good. I can speak with this if this is going to help. Does that help anybody? Is this on?
Yes, it is.
Okay, so if that helps, I can speak with the microphone. I was using my teacher voice there, but if this helps in the back, great. So what you think of from history is there's lots of political theorists that have said, look, there's people and they're basically created good. They have a good nature. Others have argued, nope, they're basically bad. They tend to rob, steal, plunder, take advantage of you by their very nature. And the founders were saying, there's portions of both in us. To keep a representative form of government, you have to build character that is commensurate with representation, with self-government, right? The whole American experiment is one of, can we live as a self-governing people? And that idea is staked on the idea, the premise, that we have to be able to do that as an individual. Okay, so with that as our starting point, and the virtues that you've been seeing right outside of this room, if you have this sheet, pull it out if you would, please. Because what I want to come back around to at the end of our time today, we'll leave time for questions. I'm also the kind of speaker where if you hear something that doesn't resonate as we're going along here, just raise your hand and jump in. We want to make this a conversation. What I'd suggest to you as a starting point here is, what do you think Madison is thinking of here when he's saying that there's certain qualities that have to justify our esteem and confidence? What's necessary to be a good citizen? What are the qualities that you would see? Yes, right there. And maybe you could just tell me where you're from out of curiosity.
I'm from Traverse City, Michigan,
Okay.
and I would say integrity.
What is integrity?
Basically, doing your own work, being honest about your work,
Yeah.
doing the right thing.
So if you have integrity, you're a whole, right? Public and private cohere. You're one. Yes, jump in.
I was gonna say honesty as well, but
Okay.
you said it too.
Where are you from?
I'm from Lapeer, Michigan.
Up here. Okay. Honesty. You see a lot of honesty in public life today? How are you doing this week with each other as you're starting to push for bills? You feel like you can be honest with one another? How do we get to a place of candor? How do we get to a place of managing disagreement, not eliminating it, right? Honesty is a big one. Others? Yes, sir.
Spring leg and accountability.
Okay, what does that mean to you?
Like, if you mess up, then if you realize it and you kind of accept it and own up to your actions.
Accountability, right? Lincoln writing to Grant, I was wrong, you were right. Do we see that a lot with public officials?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so we've had some good ones: integrity, honesty, accountability. Yes, sir.
The ability to compromise.
Okay, ability to compromise. That's interesting. Then we'll go right to you. We'll get a couple others here.
Gratitude.
Gratitude, nice. Yes.
Respect.
Okay, and where are you guys from?
Oh, I'm from Grand Rapids, Michigan.
Grand Rapids.
Troy.
Okay,
Gladwin.
excellent. Okay, another one. Yes.
Honor.
Honor, and where are you from?
Coopersville.
Okay, couple more in the back, and then we'll stop with our list. Thank you.
Humility.
Yep.
Prudence.
Okay. I'll throw in a couple others. I can't resist. Okay, and you guys are, where are you from in the back?
Lapeer.
Alto.
We got two from Lapeer. Okay, Alto. Excellent. You guys are, I'll bring up, round out the list. Responsibility.
I was
Okay.
gonna say like boldness within ideas, not necessarily like proposal.
Yeah, boldness or confidence there. Let's pause there. That's a great list. How do you build those? How does it happen? Do you guys have a plan to do that in your lives? Because those are a lot of abstract terms until you make it real in your life. Let me tell you how Ben Franklin did it in his. Because just a little bit older than you, he looked at himself and he did a kind of self-audit. And he said, you know what? I'm pretty slovenly. I'm not very organized. I don't keep my resources. And then he went to a buddy of his. He wrote down a list of things that he needed to work on, right? And he went to a buddy of his, and he found somebody that was willing to kind of be pretty honest with him. His list was 12 in length, and this friend of Franklin's said, you know what, you're kind of pompous. You're full of pride. And Franklin, to his credit, who said humility? So Franklin put down humility. And so he had a list, and he said, you know what, I can set out on a project, and my project can be one in which I'm going to better myself. How many of you done something like that? Okay, so here was, a lot, that's great. Here was Franklin's methodology. He got a little book, and he said, what I'm gonna do is work on one virtue, and every time I mess up, I'm gonna have to put a little black mark. And what he could do is work through them and say, once I start seeing the black marks dissipate, maybe I've come to a kind of mastery. It's really hard to do, right? To hold yourself to account. Franklin found most of the things that he was working on to be able to be not completely mastered. He wasn't self-delusional, but he really struggled with humility. He really had a problem, and that's one of the reasons why I wrote that book, because I was fascinated at how would you go about trying to acquire humility? Because there's a little bit of a paradox, and Franklin put it this way: just as soon as you think you had reached the pinnacle of humility, you might be proud of your humility, right? You might have an excess of kind of like, well, I've really landed, I've really arrived. So that was Franklin's methodology. What he realized as an 80-year-old man is that he had never gotten humility right. That it's really hard to stop and say, as you have to do this week, let me really hear what other people are saying. Really listen, really understand, right? How do you be civil? How do you be empathetic? Franklin was that guy. I don't know if any of you have friends like this. I have a lot of friends who are in this category, where they were much more eager to talk than to listen. That was Franklin. And he would absolutely light into people if they were wrong. He did not suffer fools. And what he had to realize over his lifetime, from that time in his 20s when he tried to gain mastery over himself, until he was a very old man, he recognized that the discipline required to listen to people, to understand from their perspective, to shut up and learn, was the most difficult. There's a great moment in the Constitutional Convention when, after 5 months of working together, a long, hot summer, middle of May to the middle of September, right? So tack on a couple of weeks on the other end when Madison is getting there and staying on afterwards, right? It's a really long time. It's a hard slog. They're doing some of the things that you're doing here. You're negotiating, right? You're trying to understand each other. Where are you coming from? What kind of legislation do you want to pass? What kind of things, what kind of issues animate you? And they'd scratched the surface early on with some very difficult issues, including slavery, including what kind of an executive should we have as a country? How should the different branches of government relate to each other? These issues, by the point they had gotten in September of the Constitutional Convention, had largely been settled. One issue in particular, how much representation each state should get, threatened to throw the whole thing apart and to scuttle it. And what Franklin did in the speech was to say what he'd learned over his lifetime was that listening, learning, who said compromise? Recognizing that giving something for the sake of unanimity was worth it. And after that speech, they were able to move towards the resolution of that long, hot summer's worth of deliberation. My point is, if you want to become a person of integrity, if you want to become a person of honor, if you want to become a person who is accountable, if you want to become honest, you have to have a plan and work that plan. Let's come back to these virtues at the end of our time together. I want to do a kind of lightning round looking at 4 dates in particular. Because we're now almost to July 4th, 2025. What happens on that date? What is notable about July 4th, 2025? Right there?
Fireworks.
Okay, so we get, why do we do fireworks? Yeah.
When the US came Independence Day,
Okay, so what does this one mark? What if we were, yes, right there?
the Declaration.
Yep, so we did the Declaration of Independence is what, and we're gonna talk a little bit about that. What number would it be in terms of a birthday?
249.
249, so fast forward 1 year, we're at the big one, right? We're at 250. The semi-quincentennial. The 250th. How many of you, here I'll ask for a show of hands from everybody, how many of you think the United States of America has another 250 years in us? Okay, great. Good vote of confidence. A few not so certain. What about 100? What about 50? This occasion gives us pause, does it not? It gives us an occasion to think, what is it going to take to sustain a republic? We saw Madison's contention that it takes character. I'll also say that it takes a preservation of our institutions. So let's go back to July 1776. Maybe step back even 1 month. Thomas Jefferson, 33 years old, gets handed the pen, the quill pen, right? Adams was kind of in charge. He was probably thinking that he might take the first cut at the Declaration, right? He was pretty confident in his writing abilities. But he handed it off to Jefferson. And Jefferson, like a lot of people, you've probably done this with a paper that's due, he waited a little bit. He didn't have that much time, but he was kind of crashing on writing the Declaration of Independence. He did it over the course of several weeks. you can visit the place that he wrote it in Philadelphia. It's called now Declaration House. So Jefferson at one point, writing this document, which I hope you all have read, writes a word. And he's trying to figure out what are Americans? What are this new people, right? How should we refer to ourselves? We know now the word that he wrote on top of it because we take it for granted. Citizen. That's what we call ourselves. But the word that he wrote down and had to scratch out, you guys don't use pen and ink very much anymore. But if you did and you really didn't want any subsequent generation to read it, you might do what Jefferson did, which was kind of scratch over it and keep writing. The word that he wrote, does anybody know how he referred to us initially? Yeah,
I'm guessing he said subjects.
you're right. Subjects. The change from subjects to citizens was everything. It was a big shift. It was a huge change in mentality. What does it mean to be a subject? Yeah.
Like you're kind of like, you don't have to be involved in leadership, but you're kind of just controlled by someone else.
Yeah. What happens to all those virtues? By the way, where are you from?
Rochester.
Okay, great. What happens to most of those virtues that we talked about when you're a subject? Do you have accountability? Do you have the ability to be self-governing? A lot of them go out the window, and what you look to is your leaders, and you say, well, if I'm a subject, you gotta go do it. Think of that mentality. Think of that shift that happens. The reason that Jefferson struck that word so stridently is he did not want Americans to think of themselves as subjects. We had a new destiny. You know why we know that word that he struck through? For a long time, until 2010, we didn't. The Library of Congress developed a special technology that allowed them to scrape back the layers of being. And now we can see that we moved from subjects to citizens. So that's what 1776 stands for, right? The Declaration of Independence moves us from a place in which we're subject to our leaders, to a king, to one in which we're self-governing citizens. The Constitution puts those principles, the idea of human equality, liberty for all, into place. If you pull out that sheet and you flip over to the other side, what you see are things that we've called at the Bill of Rights Institute the founding principles. Many of these will be common to you from classes that you've had in history. How many of you have taken a class in civics? I know Michigan requires a class. So I won't go through all of those, but the long and short of it is that you have at the bottom a foundation in inalienable rights, liberty, equality, justice. The next level up there, after the foundation, Republican government, right? Representative government. That's what Madison was referring to. Consent, a critical cornerstone. Here the people rule. Right? That's what Hamilton said. We're not ruled. The next step up is limited government. That means we have the rule of law, due process. And if you go up one more level, you're finding something that for those of you that have really thought about the Federalist Papers, you know pretty well, auxiliary precautions. This is the idea that because human beings are willing to take advantage of a situation because of those lower, baser qualities, you gotta construct a government so that if the worst among us get in power, they can't do as much damage. So that's why you separate the powers, why you have checks and balances, and why you have federalism, okay? The next level up is the Bill of Rights. And there's an interesting story there. If we want to return to it in the Q&A, we can. But initially, the Constitution did not include a Bill of Rights. It came about because many states said, you know what, if you want us to pass this thing, you gotta write down some of this stuff and codify it, constitutionalize it. Because the writ of habeas corpus, the right to free speech, the right to assemble, the right to petition for redress of grievances, right? The things that we now know by heart that are part of the Bill of Rights were not originally included. And the Anti-Federalists said it's so vital, we need to have those things written down. Now here's the thing. Most countries on the planet today have a Bill of Rights. And most of them are as valuable in protecting rights as this sheet of paper is. Madison's term was parchment barrier. It's just a paper barrier, right? If you were a member, if you were a subject in the Soviet Empire and you had a Bill of Rights, it didn't really matter. Today, the people of North Korea have a very robust Bill of Rights in their constitution. And it's run roughshod over. So the fact that we write these things down, that we have a written constitution, is special, but it's not the reason that our rights ultimately endure. Those rights endure because we believe in, because we bring accountability to our elected officials, and because we have fought for them, including the fine men in this room who have done so in time of war. That's why our rights actually endure, and why we can have responsibilities as citizens. When you think of it, it's a pretty profound conclusion, right? Now I want to go forward with a couple of other dates, because you get the foundation laid in 1776, you put the Constitution into place, you have your formal architecture, right? You're building the kind of foundations. You have to have the character to make it stick and make it work. And so if you advance, you know, we're next year going to be in the 250th. On the 150th birthday of this country, Calvin Coolidge gave a speech in 1926. It's a pretty interesting speech. And what Coolidge said is, when you state that all men are created equal, that's fine. You don't have to add anything to it. That's a statement that is true then, today, and forever. Okay? But what did that mean for people for whom the rights have been denied? Right? We still ask those questions today. Does it seem like liberty and equality are available to all? That's one of the questions that you're wrestling with this week. I know from hearing reports about some of the things that issues that you're grappling with. That's front and center. Frederick Douglass in 1852 gave a speech that all of you should think about. Have any of you read or even heard, you can listen to it online, What to the Slave is the 4th of July? Anybody? It's a great speech. So we need to have a lot more people go and check this out. Pull it up on YouTube, read it, because what Douglass said at that time is, I think, a word for us today as we're thinking about our next 250 years. So do y'all know the story of Frederick Douglass? He was a man who, during his entire teenage years, from birth until about the age of 20, was enslaved. He didn't know who his father was. He had to make up a date for his birthday. He saw his mother 3 times. Douglass, like her, taught himself how to read. He did so and came into possession of a book. The book was called the Columbian Orator. This book taught him about liberty. It taught him that he, a black man, was a human being. That he possessed the same rights as any other person. And that the denial of his rights to him as a human being was wrong. What Douglass did was take that knowledge and put it into action. Because what Douglass had to come to realize was something that was very problematic, to say the least. Because society and his slave owners wanted to make him their subject. The worst thing that could happen for a slave was for them to start reading. In fact, when Douglass's slave owner, his master as they were called, overheard his wife teaching Douglass how to read, he forbade it. But it was too late. Douglass had learned about liberty. What he now had to figure out was how would he gain that for himself. Once he had made himself more dangerous, armed with that knowledge, Douglass was sent out to be broken. And this resulted in a terrible period of physical torment, where the man set to, quote unquote, break him would beat him up every day. Until Douglass had resolved that he was not going to take that action any longer, and he stood up to him. And after that, that man didn't lay a finger on Douglass. It took him a few more months before he figured out a way that he could escape. But he did so. He went north from Maryland and went to New York, spent time in Massachusetts, became America's best known orator around abolitionism. He became famous. If you come to Washington, D.C., I hope you all have a chance to do this, go to the Frederick Douglass House. It's called Cedar Hill. Douglass is a hero of mine. And I think he's the man for our hour, because in this speech that I mentioned, What to the Slave is the 4th of July, he starts off by saying to Americans, you know, you really need to think about your core documents. You need to think about how you are going to live up to the principles of the Declaration and the Constitution. You need to figure out how to bring what he, Douglass, called the saving principles into your heart and mind. I think that's the task for today. I think that's your, dare I say it, calling. You're here because you're curious about these things. I know from talking to those who are running this program that you all are thinking seriously about these things. What do the saving principles mean to you? What can they mean to us in common? The reason that I think Douglass is the man for our kind of hour and time of need in this country is he knew what it was to be alienated from those principles. Some of you might know the name Colin Kaepernick. He hasn't been on the scene as much lately, but when he quoted from this speech of Douglass's, he quoted from the first part, when Douglass was saying to his fellow Americans, you have done me a great harm. The institution of slavery is wrong and evil. But what I wish Colin Kaepernick had done in pointing us to that speech is point to the second half as well. Because it's in that second half that Douglass says, you know what, even though you've done me this great wrong, and slavery still exists in this country, you can do better. Because the principles are there. That's what Coolidge meant in 1926 on the 150th, to say that those principles are final. You don't need to add to them, but you do have to put them into practice. I want to close by noting a speech and a thing that happened in our country that some of you may be very familiar with, and a speech given by a man who wasn't much older than you all, John Lewis. So how do we put those principles into action? Everybody knows of the March on Washington. The most famous speech was given by Martin Luther King Jr. I have a dream is how it's come to be known. Some of you may be even able to recite the thing. The third speaker on that day was John Lewis, and he was a firebreaker. He had to submit his remarks for approval by the powers that be on that day. And John Lewis talked in terms that were kind of like the first half of Douglas's speech. When is America going to live up to the promise of the Declaration? When is it going to actually put those saving principles into practice? And he got some feedback. And the feedback on the speech led him to craft a phrase that I think is really beautiful. And this is what John Lewis said on that day, that we have to continue to put into practice, to try to realize, to bring to fulfillment the revolution of 1776. Isn't that an interesting idea? In other words, what Lewis was saying is that there's a continuity. If you get the principles right, which I would argue today that we did, what you have to do is work assiduously to put them into practice. If all human beings are created equal, and you have the institutions that are capable of realizing that, the question that Lewis was putting to his audience was, do we have the character? Do we have the will? Do we have the resolve? I'd say we're in the same place today. And as we get ready to celebrate the revolution of 1776 this year, and throughout the next year as we look forward to the semi-quincentennial, we'll just call it A250 for short, do we have what it takes to put those principles into practice? To have the character? You will not gain that character as a collective. It can only come from you having a plan like Franklin did, like any great leader ever does, to affect that change in your own heart. And so what I'll leave you today with is, and then we have lots of time for your questions and thoughts. What's your plan? How do you make this happen in your own hearts and minds? What are you going to do to make sure that those virtues are not just posters on the wall, and as handy as it is to have this in your pocket, the most important thing is that you actually take it to heart. Let me stop there. Thank you for your time and attention, and let's have more time for questions here. Yes, sir.
What led you to the Bill of Rights Institute?
Well, I had a teacher, and I had parents, and they both kind of put me on the path. So my teacher, I was the kind of student, maybe some of you are like this, you don't have to raise your hand if you are, but I was pretty confident in my views in high school, and I had lots of them. And this teacher was very good about saying, you need to think about different sides. You need to understand, yes, your own views, but do you understand the opposing viewpoints as well as you do your own? Because if you don't, you haven't dug deep enough. And so he challenged me in that way. And my parents weren't political, but what they did at dinner table conversations was just talk about stuff. And the kind of love that I gained about your age, I was a boys' stater in Minnesota, of current events, of issues that were happening. And I got involved in politics, and I loved that. And I figured that I might end up on Capitol Hill, but instead I kept asking questions. And so I went into a PhD program, decided that I would teach at the college level, and after doing that for about a decade, I realized that I want to help our educational system as a whole. And now we support thousands of teachers, including, well, really tens of thousands across the country, about 83,000 overall, and a couple thousand in this state. And what we're trying to do is make the things that I've been talking about today the heart of civics and history curricula. So we publish free online materials that teachers can use, videos. We have a great YouTube channel. How many of you have AP history or history coming up? Okay, maybe, how many of you have taken it already? All right, so if you need homework help, just YouTube that and you'll find the Bill of Rights Institute online. There's a lot of resources that we have for students, different programs, and even contests that you can avail yourself of. So that's kind of a little bit about my journey. Yes, sir. You're from where?
I'm from Gladwin, Michigan.
Where is that?
It's about mid-Michigan,
Okay.
right in the middle almost.
Very good.
So I had previously asked a political science guy,
Yeah.
sort of mine from Kirtland Community College.
Yes.
Is it better to compromise your opinion on something when facing direct opposition from a large group of people, or is it better to take that defeat for self-preservation?
Okay, so your two alternatives are, paint that picture again for everybody, if you would please, and for me.
So, when you are faced in a debate, and it seems as if you are the only one with your opinion, and everyone else is in collective agreements on something else, is it better to take that loss for self-preservation, or to compromise your feelings for the momentum of the debate?
This will probably not be the most satisfactory answer, but it would depend on what we're talking about, right? The moral, political, constitutional, ethical reasoning and conviction that Frederick Douglass had could not be compromised around the question of human equality, right? We can't put that to a vote. The truths of the Declaration of Independence that are ironclad, that all human beings are created with unalienable rights, that you cannot put to a vote. So what you want to do is, with Douglass, I think, on certain key things like that, you have to stand as a majority of one, right? There's no way to compromise away certain things. A principle can't be, by its very definition, voted out. That's the messiness of our democratic republic, though, right? We're trying to figure out what are those core things on which we have agreement. Here's the thing, it seems like we're really, really divided as a people, right? I'm giving a talk to the National Council for the Social Studies later today, and it's on the question of civil discourse. It is very hard. I've lived and worked in the Washington, D.C. area now for nearly 2 decades. Seen up close, worked with hundreds of members of Congress. And it seems sometimes when we look at Washington, D.C., that it is almost impossible to have civil discourse. Here's the thing though, we're actually more united as a people than it seems. 70% of the American electorate believes that the Declaration and Constitution should be the touchstones for our civics and history education. About 70 to 80% agree on the core things, the core principles. And yet, what we tend to do is to think that we're on the brink of the Civil War. Why is that? Because of negative affective polarization, right? Just like this room has a division down the line, we tend to say through this thing that political scientists call negative affective polarization, push ourselves farther and farther to the edges, right? But the people on the edges, the 10% over here, I'm not saying that you all actually do this, but the 10% over here, let's just pretend that this is our country for a second. They're very loud, and they get a ton of attention. And in between 60, 70, 80%, you might think of them as the group More in Common did. They called them the exhausted majority. They're the kind of people, probably many of you have friends like this, where they're like, I don't want to talk about that stuff that you're talking about this week. Are you kidding? I'll lose all my friends. People want to keep their friends. And what negative affective polarization does is it pushes us apart, and the extremes right now are loudest. And what happens is we lose our ability to go to the core issues that you're talking about right now. I applaud the fact that Boys State centers on issues that are very contentious, right? You're talking about abortion, gun control, right? Issues around transgenderism. What else? What are some of the other big issues that you're facing right now in your deliberations?
Like dealing with drugs, like what sort of
Okay.
drugs you're allowed, what you're not.
Drugs,
Immigration.
others in the back,
The deficit.
okay?
The deficit.
So, all the easy questions, right? I mean, you're going to third rail stuff. And a lot of Americans right now are exhausted because they feel like there's no way to touch the third rail without getting electrocuted. What do we have to do to get beyond polarization? Exactly what you're doing. So, but go back to your question. On a lot of those issues, like for example, the deficit, you have to think, is there an ironclad, permanent principle at stake here? Because on those kind of questions of fiscal import, I think that there's probably room, if I'm understanding your two scenarios, for giving a little bit more, right? And you might think of issues within that kind of a continuum. What are my bedrock principles? And on those, I should not be outvoted. I probably shouldn't even sway and zig and zag. But on others, there may be principles involved. There always are. But you might have more room actually to maneuver in terms of a compromise. I think one of the things that you can do profitably over the course of this week is try to figure out what issues fall into where. And what you'll start to get better at as you do more of this, and for the two of you who get to go on to Boys Nation, I'll see you, by the way, next month there at Marymount University. You'll have to have navigated, how do you bring consensus? How do you bring a majority to bear when people feel like they're giving up something that's very core to who they are? Because that's the difficulty of politics. So that's a start of an answer. It's a very, very good question. Yes?
If people are innately bad, do you believe that any form of government can be innately good because it's made up of entirely people?
Yeah, so when I spoke to what the founders believe about human nature earlier, I didn't mean to suggest that they or I see that human beings are innately evil or bad. Because I think what they see is that there is, in religious terminology, a kind of fallenness, or non-religious views, a kind of inadequacy to the task, right? That human beings do have a proclivity to do bad things. Hobbes and Locke, who heavily influenced the founders, saw human beings as imperfect in the state of nature. But also, they would not be able to be perfected. I think that's what your question might be getting at, right? So, if we go back to that quotation from Madison that we started with, what Madison's trying to convey there is we're a mixture of the bad and the good. And so, you gotta construct government in light of the bad, but also don't make government into a vehicle for trying to perfect people. People cannot be made perfect. We will always struggle with those vices. You notice if you look at your the posters here, the way that we kind of came up with this is channeling Aristotle, right? So let's take courage, for example. Aristotle would say courage is the golden mean between two extremes. Does anybody know what the extremes are? So on one hand, you might have rashness, right? George Washington, a few years older than you, when he was a soldier, touched off a global war because he was rash. That's not courage. He wanted to be courageous. He came to courage later in his life, but initially I think what he was interested in most was his ego and his ambition. And what Washington had to do, like Franklin, was go on a path of self-improvement. Now, the other extreme from rashness is cowardice, right? And that's just shirking the battlefield, not running into it too hastily. The golden mean, the virtue, is courage. And so what we're trying to do in life is achieve those virtues. And Madison is asking, really, is predicating his whole political philosophy, the whole political theory of the Constitution, of which he was the father. I think he rightly deserves that title. His whole idea was, look, you do have to be able to trust people enough for self-government. Think of what it took, though, to be in that position of the founders. They have more confidence in human beings than other regimes, I would argue, right? They have a better view then, you think, of the human possibility. Because they're the ones that said we're going from subjects to citizens. Remember, if you're a subject, what's expected of you? Nothing. You just have to follow orders. That's a really low view of human nature, of what human beings can accomplish. Here, what the United States founding did was say for the first time, we have so much confidence in people that they don't have to be ruled by others. They can have self-rule. Does that go to your question?
Yeah.
Yes?
So aside from the Frederick Douglass speech,
Yes.
Do you have any other recommendations for any other like speeches or books about the virtues that you talked about?
There's a lot. We have a curriculum called Heroes and Villains, and it goes through each one of these virtues and gives examples. I think the main thing I'd say is, sometimes when we think of stories, we imagine a person being of pre-made perfection, right? Like George Washington was always the man. He was always the guy. He had everything figured out. In fact, as a movie will show that's going to debut on July 4th, 2026, young Washington was wrestling just as much as all of you did, just as much as I did as a teenager, with how to become a man, how to become a person of character. And so what's interesting to me in these kind of stories is to imagine what allows a General Dwight Eisenhower, we just marked D-Day, right? You go read his proclamation that he gave to the troops on that day. But do any of you know what the thing that he jotted down said? It didn't make it into as many history books because we didn't have to use it. But do you know what Ike wrote down? He said, if this fails today, if I have misjudged where we should have this landing of 156,000 soldiers and sailors, the blame for its failure is mine alone, not the men who fought. That is responsibility, right? So take stories like that. There's a lot of them on the Bill of Rights Institute site. If you write me later, I'd be happy to send you links of other books that I think you should write. But the main thing is not the volume of what you read, but just go back tonight and read the Declaration of Independence. Read it, if you don't have time to do it tonight, on July 4th. And think, what did it take to sign that thing? A lot of the men who signed that document were not much older than you are. What are you doing to put yourself in the position? Like Franklin and like Washington, like Eisenhower, like Harriet Tubman. I wrote about Abigail Adams in the book that was mentioned. Men and women become people of character through hard work. That's the lesson that I take away. We'll do a couple of really quick questions, I think. Do we have time?
Got a couple minutes.
Couple minutes. Okay, so we'll
Maybe one more.
okay.
Maybe one more.
Right here, please.
Back on the topic of courage, I'm pretty sure it was. Are you suggesting that we should limit or I guess moderate the expression of our beliefs in a sense?
Oh no. I mean, I think the expression of your beliefs is important. The refinement of them is perhaps even more important. In other words, you have the right to peacefully protest. You can exercise that right, and it's been done to immense good in the history of this country, right? The speech at which John Lewis, the gathering at which he spoke was one of the largest demonstrations and protests in our history, right? So it's not so much a matter of quelling or limiting your expression, but I think what's important is to keep refining it and to recognize that you need to be open to challenge. If you become so impassioned about your own views that you're blind to the challenges that are there, you won't improve, right? So as you're trying to forge compromise here in your legislation, you gotta really be able to listen to the other side. Not just push your own convictions, however right they might be. You see the tension there? There's a healthy tension. And what you don't wanna go over into kind of an unhealthy tension. You all are in high school now. A recent survey of high school students revealed that 56% of high school students in the United States right now feel comfortable disagreeing with their peers or their teacher in the class. That means that 2 out of 5 of young people your age do not feel comfortable disagreeing. That's not good. We need to regain a sense of what it is to be comfortable with disagreement so that we can stand on those principles. I'll stop there. I'm happy to stick around a little bit. I don't know what is next on your program, but thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.